So welcome everyone to this digital fireside, in which we'll be exploring the question of how we can all flourish in an age of AI with our very special guest, Nathalie Nahai. Of course, AI is raising some pretty fundamental questions for us all. I've recently come across the observation that we need to essentially complete a course in philosophy with a deadline. It's asking questions about our future, how we can go about solving our problems and hopefully avoid making them considerably worse. And it raises fundamental questions about what it's going to mean to be human in the years ahead. We had our recent Coffee with a Cause session, of course, with We and AI, and supported them in their mission of involving the public in better understanding both the threats and opportunities of AI. And of course, in the fairly short space of time, particularly since ChatGPT was launched, there's been both tremendous excitement, but also a lot of trepidation around AI. The Financial Times, for example, which is not generally known as a Luddite publication, has taken quite a stern line in its editorials, warning about a clear and present danger from AI. This is an example of one of the weekend magazine covers from the FT asking if AI will completely tear us apart. But on the other hand, with a polycrisis environment and some really tricky problems to solve feeding into each other and making each other worse, we may need a sort of higher order of organizing intelligence to extricate ourselves from those difficulties. And AI has many positive applications. In our first ever Coffee with a Cause, we worked with Monique Tungia and her Green Girls, who developed AI algorithms to optimize renewable energy for African villages, for example. So what does this mean for us at Marketing Kind? Is our role as marketers just to understand technology and how we can harness it to serve our business goals, the goals of our brands, the goals of our clients? Or do we have a more fundamental role to play in looking after the health of the systems that make those goals possible in the first place? And what does this mean for the future of human agency, individually, professionally, and culturally? Well, from my perspective, we couldn't be in better company to find out. I've been hoping to involve Nathalie in Marketing Kind for some time. From my perspective, we'll hear more about Nathalie's career, but from my perspective, Nathalie has triple jumped her way to the stratosphere. Firstly, with a book that I think most people will know, Webs of Influence, which got translated into 13 million languages, and is sort of the Bible of online technology and psychology, and gave rise to the moniker of the web psychologist. And then, of course, secondly, and more recently, Business Unusual, my take on which is that it's a book that provides the psychological insight and basis for formulating a narrative of meaning and purpose that we can use to grow organizations and build more resilience in the face of tumultuous times than conventional approaches to business planning. And of course, Nathalie is also very well known for curation and hosting, including the Hive podcast that I had the good fortune to be interviewed on recently. So Nathalie, that's kind of given some of the highlights, but how do you, well, first of all, what's most alive in you today?
Well, I like that question. Amanda Scott asked that question quite a bit. I actually have an answer today, because usually I don't, and it might be a little bit left field, but the pursuit of beauty, and I don't mean beauty in a kind of simplistic sense. I've been thinking about how when it comes to things like turbulence and chaos and precarity and encountering difficulty of sort of the scale and complexity that we're facing, it can be really helpful to find a way to orient yourself towards life, if you like, and not get overwhelmed completely. And I've been kind of trying to find a way that holds everything together, like these, I guess, like fibers in a trunk, to synthesize these different aspects of the work that I do, the interest that I have, to help me feel like there is a sense of coherent forward momentum and rooting. And I think that that's sort of comes under the, I guess, the canopy of beauty. So beauty in music, beauty in art, beauty in relationships, beauty in the way that we show up and give compassion to people. So there's a lot around that, about the transcendental aspects of very ordinary ways in which we can create and respond to beauty. So yeah, so that's kind of been very present for me, especially the last few days. So that's, I don't know if that's a way left field for someone who writes about, you know, behavioral science and marketing and tech. And
it's wonderful.
Yeah.
And to continue the tree metaphor, I think that gives us some roots that we're gonna, you know, grow during the interview. And of course, just to remind people, so I'm gonna sort of lead for a little while, but we'll leave at least half an hour for group discussion, so everyone can put their own questions to Nathalie. But just to give us a stable building block, how do you construe the sort of stages of your career so far and how you got to this point, and what's your sort of footprint of activities today?
Might be easier to work backwards. So I have a lot going on. My partner calls me an octopus because there's always like multiple approaches, several tendrils, each with their own sense and intelligence, and often fighting with one another, which makes moving forward quite chaotic. But part of those, well, the footprint in an octopus sort of setting includes the painting that I do. I moved to Barcelona 3.5, it wasn't 3.5, it was 6.5 years ago, for a sabbatical, and ended up doing a 3.5-year course in realist painting, which I absolutely loved. It was just transformative. And so I paint most days. I've been writing music since I was very little, and I play music with friends and gig. The podcast is currently undergoing a big rebrand, which again is that whole thing of figuring out what the voice is and how it connects to a deeper sense of bringing meaning and value to people. And then there's a Flourishing Futures Salon, which I'm working on, which are these intimate dinners, which you will be attending once I've got the date in the diary, which will be at the end of September, which brings people together of different disciplines with no tech and no titles. So you're not allowed your phone and you're not allowed to say what you do. And that strips away some of that status kind of hustling of, do I look good if I give my status? Is someone else better than me? Or, you know, all of that stuff that kind of reduces that. And so that I've been working on and thinking about taking that into an organizational setting. So what that could look like. I do keynotes. I do a bit of emceeing on the side sometimes. And I've just started a new project with a friend of mine, Dr. Aaron Balick, who's an amazing psychotherapist and friend, who, with him, we're doing, creating a project called Time to Show Up, which looks at two lenses on how to engage in challenging or transformative life stages. So people who are in the kind of coaching seats, the hot seat we're calling it, and people who've overcome specific challenges to be able to extract, with their consent and collaboration, what are the key things that have worked, and what does that mean in terms of the frameworks that we have available to us to help those who are going through similar things. So it's like there's a lot going on now. That's kind of, you know, some of the mix.
There's so much going on that I feel I know about quite a lot of what you do, and you've managed to cover all of the things that even I didn't know about with my preparation. So that's huge. My sense is that you, in a way, a bit like me, sort of went independent relatively at a young age compared to sort of, you know, a lot of people who maybe move on to a portfolio career a little bit, you know, later on, albeit in a way that is probably now becoming far more popular from a much younger age. What have been, you know, you've done a lot of client work, you've worked with a lot of big organizations, a lot of breakthrough organizations. You also have a lot of the sort of artist in you, obviously. What have been the sort of challenges and opportunities of going independent in quite turbulent times and from quite an early stage?
Well, I mean, the only time I ever worked for anyone else was, well, 2 times. One, when I used to read tarot at age 20, 21, I kind of got invited to come along, which I enjoyed. And then it started getting a bit much. And I realized that actually a therapist might be better placed than some 21-year-old helping people coming in with quite significant challenges. So there was that. And the other thing I was hired for was to work in a pub, which I loved when I was at university. That was really fun. But other than that, I've never worked for anyone. And I think that's probably because, so in my 20s, I was a professional musician and touring quite a lot. And I found it to be quite, I mean, it was fun, but it was extremely stressful. And it was an industry that was just really brutal. And I think because I'd seen how difficult it was almost kind of in my mind, I was just thinking, am I allowed to swear on this?
Of course. I
was like, right, you fuckers, I'll show you. And so there was all of this, and especially because there weren't that many women doing really well. I'm kind of in folk music, and it was just full of, and I love men. It's just like some blokes holding power in specific institutions. And I was just livid. I was like, how dare you be the gatekeepers when there are these extraordinary people, and not just other women, but also other musicians. And so it was this kind of like anger that just fueled me. And I thought, right, I'm just going to carve my own path and sod the rest of you. I'm going to do it anyway. And so I kind of did. And I think it was that combined with an extraordinary and blessed naivety of, I'll write a book, how hard can it be? Turns out it's quite hard, but once you've committed, I kind of thought I should finish. And that was kind of the decision-making that led me to where I am now. But I think it's also, I don't know if I'd be a great employee. I'm quite, I need a lot of stimulation and freedom and flexibility, and my schedule is all over the place. So yeah, I'd rather come in and help people and collaborate than be fixed into a place. Because then everything can cross-pollinate and you get a much better version of me than if I was just in one role, which works much better for some people. I think it's kind of figuring out what helps you to thrive most and then exploring at the edges of that.
Yeah, and my sense is that you attach a lot of importance to becoming a particular version of you that isn't held back by an organizational context. I mean, Nassim Taleb, talks about, he says that consultants in a big consultancy, Deloitte, for example, essentially are fragile in that if something sort of unusual happens, there's more downside for them than upside. Whereas a musician, in a sense, is anti-fragile in that, the more you hear about, the more you likely are to buy their songs. And the instance that came to mind after I first read that passage, I remember Madonna. There was a wardrobe malfunction that meant that a cape was meant to be ripped off her back.
Yeah.
But it didn't come off. And so essentially her backing dancers pulled her backwards off the stage. She climbed back on the stage and continued the song. And actually she was on the sort of main 6 o'clock, 10 o'clock news, probably in more than 50 countries around the world. I'd have quite liked her royalties that night. And so you can see how that is. But just thinking today, I mean, you do have really corporate clients. You've got the Googles on the one hand, and I kind of very much associate that with the sort of readership of the Webs of Influence book. But on the other hand, you're sort of creating courses in the relationship between digital and the human with grassroots activists like Vandana Shiva. So what's the sort of sweet spot of, is it the big corporate change? Is it the more radical change? Or what are the kinds of opportunities that you see as most Nathalie shaped to amplify?
I'm so unused to being in the hot seat. So much easier asking the questions. It depends. Like if money were no issue, like if I didn't have to think about spending, like I could just, and I don't need a lavish lifestyle, but I like great food and I like to travel and I'd like a slightly bigger flat so I can have a studio attached. If all of that was looked after, then the answer would be very specific. So I think the thing that most ignites me is to have a way of weaving these worlds together, because there are extraordinary people in all places, in all roles. And it's just this kind of, there's this weird siloing that we do where we think that if someone's a CMO or a CEO or they're an artist or they're a teacher or whatever it is, that they don't have this rich inner life and these different, I don't know, it's insane to me. And I remember chatting with a good friend of mine he actually set up one of the biggest and most wonderful philosophy clubs years ago in London. I don't think it's still running anymore, but he has his own brand agency. And we've had conversations over the years. And he said to me, I think it was last year, I was like, I need to rebrand. I'm not sure exactly what. I'm not really into the web psychologist thing anymore. I'm interested in so many more things. He was like, yeah, but people need a one-liner thing to know you by. And I completely disagree. Like I've come to the point where finally I'm like, no, that is not going to be the path that I choose to take. And I hope, and I don't know if this is true, but I think it might be, is that because people are, at least the folks that I'm speaking with, are getting the picture that everything is interconnected and entangled, whether it's through, you mentioned earlier the polycrisis, whether it's that everything's entangled with AI, and if something happens, everything's affected, or biodiversity, if something suddenly collapses and we've got no wheat for a year or 2 years, then entire supply chains go down, people go hungry, or climate, up the road, I live in Barcelona, in Saragossa, which is not so far from here, there were huge floods within the last week. And so everything is connected. And so I think there is something about the moment in time where, if you want to see it in this way, and I'm certainly taking the invitation this way, there is the potential for stepping into our multimodal selves, like all of the things that you can draw upon, all of those skills, loves, longings, passions, talents, abilities. Like, now is the time to step into it and to use them, because if we don't now, when are we going to? I mean, there isn't a better time. And so that's what I've been really thinking about in terms of whether it's corporate work or more activist work. To me, everything connects. And I think the Nathalie shaped space is being someone who weaves these worlds somehow together. And that's what the Flourishing Futures kind of, the little dinners is like the smaller artistic side, if you like, but then it kind of, if I can move it into a corporate space, which is what I'm working on at the moment, then there is the potential for other kinds of magic to also happen. And I think we need magic happening everywhere. So that's what I'm betting on.
Yeah, we certainly need more magic. And I want to come back to that notion of the multimodal self. We can also think about the modular self. And we're going to get into some of the real challenges of AI and how it might affect our culture. But sort of starting with, webs of influence, because your interest in the junction point between psychology and technology is, embedded over many years now. So, how do we go about better understanding our customers, people, without taking advantage of them?
So that for me comes down to value exchange. And I'm going to use a slightly risque metaphor here, but it's like, and this is risky, and I think this points to some of the issues that we're having. Oh God, here we go. Right. So if we're thinking about consent and you think about it in a romantic context, it is fraught with complexity and difficulties. I say this as someone who is kind of a later millennial. So there is the sense that whether you're a lover or you're a customer having a user experience, we want to be at some level, most of us, but not all of us, want to have this sense of being pleased and seduced and engaged and taken on a journey. And it's got to be, obviously with some utilities, maybe it's harder said than done. So not in all cases, but I think there is something about taking pleasure in the experience, which means that there has to be certain dynamics at play. And the problem that I see that comes into both realms is, to what extent do people want to give up their agency and transparency for that play element? So for instance, maybe I'm taking this too far, but like, let's say for instance, on Instagram, which I use a lot, I kind of trained the algorithm to feed me funny animals, artists, and eco-based stuff. That's all I get and that's all I want, and it's great. And so, I've used that quite intentionally. I like the game. I know what game is playing, and I'm quite happy to be surprised and spend some of my time there. In a romantic relationship, if you have certain expectations, you're going in and you're pleasantly seduced, but it's within the realm of respectability, and that's different for different people, then also the game dynamics are being respected. So it's really that kind of thing of, what do different people expect? How much data are they willing to give up? Do they get the benefit? And then where does the consent layer lie? How much consent do you need? Because then you end up with issues like the cookies problem, or marketing stuff where if you don't want to accept any exchange in data, you end up with terrible recommendations and the whole experience is screwed. So but it's quite a delicate, complex game, I think. The one thing that I think does make a difference is agency. And so if you feel you have the agency to change your mind, that is for me the absolute fundamental key. So for a customer to say, okay, I don't want you to have my data anymore, remove it or give it back to me or let me change my settings with ease, fine. Same thing in a dating situation. I don't like this anymore. Let's stop. Fine. But it has to be that element that's in play for me, I think. Is that too much of a weird analogy for
No,
people?
I think so. I want to go a little deeper into that actually, and raise another topic that you've raised with me in a previous conversation. In that, so I really enjoy talking to you, obviously.
Likewise.
It's possible that in a few years' time, there might be occasions when I only get to talk to Nathalie's avatar.
Oh God.
Or
No.
change agent. What are your hopes or fears around the likely increasing proliferation of what has been dubbed synthetic relationships?
Yeah. So synthetic relationships, I mean, I guess it covers a multitude of sins or synthetics. That's terrible. But basically, I think we use that term to kind of point to our relationships with AI, with chatbots, with avatars. It could be any number of these things. I mean, clearly there's going to be a huge amount of development in that space, interest in that space for all sorts of reasons, and for the same drivers that have driven humanity to apply innovations to all sorts of areas. So it could be innovations in convenience. So I'm too busy. I'm going to get my virtual self to take care of X, Y, and Z. It could be for I don't want to raise this again, but like in the porn world, you're going to see it a lot, right? So you could license out your avatar and say there's a realm of behaviors that I consent to being attached to my avatar and that I say no to, and then you're potentially revolutionizing a field in which many people are at risk, giving them some sort of agency. So, and that's also, I'm not saying that lightly, like that whole industry is the one that has facilitated and pushed the development of so many different technologies that's likely to be one of the places to look if you want to see what's coming around the corner. So that one was definitely not intended. And then there's sort of the more kind of cynical criminal aspect, which is how do you, and we're already seeing this with really compelling deep fake audio and videos, how do you swindle people out of money and say that, look, your loved one is in need. You get a phone call and maybe it's your sister, your mother, your daughter, your brother, your mate saying, oh my God, I'm in a terrible state. Can you send me some money? So there's all of these different ways in which our likeness can be used against us. I was reading today about some interesting advancements happening in the States through Adobe, Microsoft, and Google, and there are others as well, about a push towards making sure that you see, just kind of like an FDA approved or US, like whether something's organic or not organic, that there should be some sort of legal requirement for certification of where particular content has been generated, if it's AI or human created. But you're always going to, the cat's out of the bag. You're always going to get people who will use stuff when it's out in order to shift people's opinions and scam people. The question is at what scale and how convincingly, and what can we do to protect ourselves? I mean, this is order of magnitudes more complex than any other kind of scamming we've seen in the past. So
yeah, there's very much a concern of mine. In my last book, I told the story of Stanislav Petrov, the nuclear operative who saw a false signal of a nuclear strike from the US, and had he been an algorithm and just followed orders, he was meant to retaliate, but he just had a sense something was wrong and decided to keep stum for longer than he was meant to, and there's a good chance that we're alive thanks to that decision. And if you contrast that with the possibility of a deep fake of a nuclear strike, for example, and what could be the repercussions of that, or how a criminal gang could move a money market for just a few minutes long enough to raise all the money that they need. Speaking of history, actually, I wanted to turn to one of our favorite historians, Yuval Noah Harari. He has some real concerns about AI. And he suggests that the very notion of the neoliberal self is under serious threat. I mean, he essentially says that, in neoliberalism, if I'm impoverished and you're a billionaire, in a sense, my life is still worth the same as yours because I have a self, I can be free, I can be accorded human rights, I know my own mind and can make my own decisions better than someone can for me. And so in a sense, there is an equality of worth between us, even if you're a successful billionaire and I'm sort of the opposite of that. And he suggests that, you know, with advances in scientific understanding, we're more of a collection of biological algorithms than an individual self. The notion that there is an essence of a pool is sort of a quasi-religious fantasy, and that AI could come along and better understand the algorithms, the modular, we talked about a sort of modular self or multimodal self a few minutes ago, that AI could better understand those different algorithms and tell us a story that will be happier, more effective, more quickly and more reliably than if we'd created our own. And I just kind of wondered where that leaves things like your values map process, which, just to remind people, in the marvelous book, Business Unusual, there is a technique for using psychological insight to build a values map that helps you tell a story of meaning and purpose that is sort of more resilient for growth in today's environment. But if AI knows us better, we know ourselves, we don't really exist as selves in the way we think we do. What are the implications for working purposefully? I mean, should we just better serve the AI gods, or how do we orientate ourselves?
So there's something here about the ineffable, I think, which gets missed, which is that, and when we talk about artificial intelligence, some folks have talked about how it's a misnomer, that we're not talking about actual artificial intelligence. We're talking about algorithms and data. And what does it actually mean to be intelligent? And also then, what does it mean to be wise? And I think there are distinctions here that get lost in the race to datafy everything and to digitize everything. And so it's very clear that we can predict behaviors to an extent. And I know that in the behavioral science and philosophical domains, there's always kind of quite a heated debate around self-determination and whether we actually have any, or whether all of our actions, behaviors, thoughts, etc., are predetermined. And yet my sense is, and this is just a sense, I'd love to hear your sense of this in the sort of like open floor section to all of you, but from what I've observed and from what I've experienced, there seems to be a quality of the existence of life that pertains to chaos, which is not orderable or measurable. And I know that there's a sense that if you zoom out, chaos just looks like patterns. But I also think there's a huge level of narcissism in that assumption that we could create anything that even comes close to making sense of and eliminating all chaos so that it becomes understandable, reproducible, and nudgeable. And I haven't really had much chance to refine this thought, but there's something around that there is always room for a new possibility or a probability to emerge. And I think we sometimes see this as well, like in the example that you gave of the nuclear retaliation, that statistically maybe someone else would have responded in a different way, maybe on a different day he might have responded differently, maybe if he was hungry and unable to think through the hunch. So I think there are all these factors that come into play, and I don't think that AI can fully understand what it is to be an embodied system. And if we go down that path, there's also the other aspect that kind of comes into play here, which is that I think part of the challenge of this conversation is also that we work with the assumption that, generally speaking, we have consciousness, we have a sense of self, and that sense of self is a singular being. And if we go down to sort of the micro level and the research that's done on things like, microbiome and changing people's moods, changing people's behaviors by the way that they eat, by fecal transplants if they've been really ill, and then what happens to their depression. Like, there's all these weird and wonderful and fascinating studies that look at the human individual as a rich, complex, and extraordinary ecosystem. And it could be that in coming years, we have AI, nano probes that go into the system and analyze everything. But to what level of complexity would we have to develop technology in order to appraise, understand, and predict the level of complexity that we are as individuals? So there's a lot in the mix. I think it's easier to predict the behavior of groups than it is to predict the behavior of individuals. And the other problem with prediction, which we've seen with social media posts, is that I think most of us, at least certainly in infancy, have an imperative towards curiosity and growth. And that means dancing at the edges of our experiencing. So trying new things, failing new things, coming across challenges. And if you give people a sense that they can't encounter new things, that everything's already decided for them, then another issue that arises is the sense of futility and nihilism. And that perhaps is an even worse and more daunting question that merits consideration.
There's some plausible possibility that our capacity for self-doubt is our greatest safety feature.
Yeah, I really like that.
So we talked in our on the Hive podcast, that there's the Descartes' famous line, "I think, therefore I am." There's a second part to it, which is I have doubt. There's a limit to my knowledge. Therefore, God / some greater form of knowledge must exist.
Yeah.
And I think that's where stories become miracles, is when one story gives way to another story that says, actually, no, that's not how the world works. The world works this way. Therefore, something new is possible that wasn't previously visible. Yeah. You talked about you sort of gave us the tree analogy when I asked what was alive in you. And I remember reading, Oscar Wilde once wrote that just as a tree keeps growing while we sleep, so too there will come a time when machines will do the work for us while we rest. And then, of course, Maynard Keynes suggested there would come an era of automated luxury, albeit he warned that there could be a sort of collective nervous breakdown because we're just not ready for that kind of luxury, or for that kind of idleness or leisure time. What's your sense of AI in the future of work? I mean, in a sense, you've talked about your own pattern, which has a lot of artistic expression and is very multimodal, and is very performative in a lot of ways. Is that the model that we all need to find our way into, or what do you see as the implications, either within marketing or more broadly, for how the world of work is going to be shaped by these technologies?
So it seems to me that a lot of I'll give 2 examples. So I recently saw a meme on Instagram of a designer using Photoshop's new AI function to create image outside of the bounds of the image that you had. So it kind of generates extensions to a landscape. So you've got, I don't know, like an A4 image, and then you can extend beyond that to make it A3, and it's very convincing. And the video of this group of designers watching this one guy do it was one of probably horror. They looked, rather than excited, they looked like they were experiencing dread and, oh my God, what does this mean for us? And then today I had a conversation with someone who's helped me with my rebranding, and we were talking about how there was a situation where a team had very little time and very little money to create a storyboard for a client, so they used Midjourney. And there was this sort of moment of both, and this sense of, isn't it amazing we're able to do this and we won the client? And the flip side, which is, that's one person less in the mix that we've hired, paid to do creative work that now has been replaced by this link in the chain, which is an AI link in the chain. And so there's this question around how much will humans be needed, what skills will be needed. And I think it's more going to be from an imaginal perspective. So what's the idea behind something? What's the concept for this piece of work? It might be checking for tone of voice. There was something else that came out recently, I think it was BuzzFeed wrote about this. There was an AI generated sequence of Barbies that were designed to match what were actually extremely offensive stereotypes of people in different countries. So for instance, my mom was born in Tehran, so you might say, okay, Iranian Barbie looks like this, and it's all of the stereotypes that you might think when you think about a woman from Iran. Or German Barbie looks like this, or, you know, or whatever. And so there's still a sense of kind of sense checking, but I think it's only a matter of time before that gets really good, in which case who will be needed to do anything? I think the problem then is not so much the future of work, but it's the future of when so many of these jobs are taken over by machines, like precision farming or whatever it might be, or creative jobs. How is the economy going to function? Like, that's where my head goes. It's not so much about the future of work. It's like, well, what does it mean when you have presumably a majority population that are unable to work because there aren't the jobs, who will then need, presumably, I'm guessing, some form of universal basic income. And having spoken to some people like Brett Scott and others who work in kind of the world of cashless societies, one of the visions is that you end up in a tokenized economy where you have, let's say, 100 credits to use and they expire over a month. So then if you're not working, you don't have ways of bringing in tokens that last longer than that, you can't save, you're then reduced in agency. Like, there's all sorts of kind of weird and wacky but not implausible projections around what happens when AI starts to remove humans from the equation of work, which seems to me inevitable. And this argument that, oh, well, it'll just create new jobs, I don't think that assumption is tested yet. And it's not like with machines where you create machines, you need people to operate the machines, then you end up with this kind of law of exponential growth. Because if you're stretching the limits of how much access we have to energy, how expensive the energy is going to become, there's also all these other factors that come into play, which people don't really talk about either. It's the ecological cost of running machines at scale in an extended way. Like, I don't know. I mean, it would be nice to see a future in which people intentionally chose to limit the use of AI to specific industries, specific jobs, and purposely, intentionally create industries and jobs for people to be able to work and flourish. But I mean, that requires the decision-making to be coming from a values-led level as opposed from just profit. And I don't know how that's going to shift if most people are still working with capitalist imperatives.
There's a line in a 16th century Spanish poem, Nocturno el oro en las sombras nace, which you might follow from living in Spain, but the idea is that by night the wolf hides in the shadows and then pounces. And something that, you know, I think we're getting terrifyingly used to is just the sense that, you know, you're working on something and then actually your real problem is something that comes out of left field and that you hadn't spotted arising. But I want to get into that, but I also wanted to ask a question, which is drawing from your podcast, actually, in terms of the impact of this on global consciousness. Because you have this question that you ask every guest, which is, what is your take on the current state of global consciousness? I took it at face value when you put it to me, but what do you mean by global consciousness, and sort of what are some of the more interesting takes that you've had on that recently?
So there's a friend of mine, it's actually Aaron, who I don't think he remembers asking me the question, but he once talked to me about the global psyche. And I think in the conversation, he was framing it from more of a Jungian perspective, the idea that there's a shared web of consciousness from which we draw stories, archetypes. Perhaps there's a felt sense of species level knowledge. I mean, it depends on how esoteric you want to get. But I like the fact that it starts from the premise of connection. And some of the questions, some of the answers that I've had to that question have been interesting in terms of what strata they kind of plug into. So I nearly dropped the question, and I did, I think, for a season, because someone said to me, and it was a psychologist in the States, said, I couldn't possibly speak to that, I'm paraphrasing here, because my experience is contextually so different to someone who's living in the other side of the world, of a different age, gender, ability, neurological type. Like, you know, take someone who's totally different to you, living a completely different life. What could there possibly be in common? And on one level, yes, that's true. And yet, on a deeper level, we're all inhabiting the same earth. We've evolved to share similar traits. When you look at the ways in which people orient their lives towards, where possible, belonging and flourishing, and that might look different in terms of how they pursue it, but there are these drives that I believe to be shared among not just humans, but also animals, and not just mammals, but also even reptiles. That if you keep going and going and going and going, you start to see patterns of behavior that are not unique to our species. And so I'm very curious about this question around what connects us, in particular when thinking about the ways in which, so Paddy LaFluffy, who I had on the show in the last season, was talking about the fact that we're now a planetary scale species, in the sense that we have internet connection that covers most of the population around most of the earth. We can make decisions in fractions of a second. We have practically instant communication. We're aware of our scope and our size. We've gotten to the point where it is now possible to deflect within certain limits oncoming asteroids, let's say, that potentially pose a threat to the Earth herself. And so there's kind of this question of, well, what would it mean if we moved into alignment with certain values that would enable us to make complex decisions that protected life on Earth, including our species? So that you can come at it from lots of different angles, but I'm interested in the connection piece that underlies all of our difference and variety.
And so to remind people that if you raise your digital hands, we might start weaving in some questions from the group. So just a heads up, and I'll keep going and interweaving as well. But it's just an interesting sort of response to that question, Nathalie, because in a sense, it's our ability to tell stories of meaning and purpose. You know, the kind that I think we both have an interest in, that has enabled humans to not just evolve like other species, but also to develop from generation to generation, and that has put us in that position where we could be sort of global stewards in a conscious, intentional way. But I also worry that those very narratives of meaning and purpose that have enabled us to develop, you know, could become maladaptive in evolutionary terms if we're not able to redirect them and to change our patterns of living and working quickly enough. I wonder how optimistic you are. In my optimistic moments, I hope that the ultimate COVID vaccine comes in the form of learning from a global health crisis how to turn our lives upside down if necessary in response to a major global problem. And then in my more pessimistic moments, the metaphor that occurs is the idea that in a sense, the climate emergency could be the failed dress rehearsal for coping with AI, you know, in that we've had the evidence of the climate emergency since 1938 and still haven't changed sufficiently. And, you know, the threats of AI could come considerably more quickly.
Yeah.
So how optimistic are you that we'll take on that mantle? And then we'll go to a question from Kim.
I don't know. I vacillate, like it sounds like you do. One thing that I take some kind of, well, there's a few things I take comfort and inspiration in. One is that it's remarkably difficult to predict the future. And this is someone who, you know, I absolutely adore Star Trek. I was raised on Star Trek, and there is something exciting about being able to imagine possible futures that makes some of them more possible. And so there's something around the not feeling like we're walking down the only road and there are no other options. So that's one. And hand in hand with that, there's also the power of being able to envision something so powerfully that you cultivate enough longing in enough people that that's what you work towards. And that I'm really interested in. And I think that's where marketing comes in, because that's storytelling, that's creating longing and desire. It's also where, again, beauty comes in. If you go to a concert, or you're sort of, I don't know, around a friend's house, and you're having some wine and someone whips out a guitar and sings a song that touches you, it's like, there are moments where you feel this sense of just acute beauty and longing that then orient you towards more generative paths. And so I think I don't know about where we're headed, but I think there's something around accepting the fact, and I'm not very good at this, it sounds like better than it probably is, and I'm working on this, like accepting the fact that life includes both beauty and suffering. And then trying to reduce the amount of suffering and focus on what brings compassion and joy, and orienting towards that without ignoring the dark stuff. So it's just a weird balancing game. I don't think we're going to be annihilated. We might. I don't think it's useful to think of it in those terms, but it's that whole kind of, if you think about it, like sometimes think about it as like riding a bike, where if you're a bit shaky on the bike, you want to make sure you see where the potholes are, but you want to make sure that you're still oriented towards a specific direction, like where are you actually going? And so it's that. And then making sure that you're in enough conversations where you get a plurality of perspectives, because often the ones at the extremes are very rarely right, but they can point you towards kind of the most dystopian, utopian possibilities, so you can find a middle ground. And I think there is hope. Otherwise I wouldn't be, and if nothing else, there was something that Joanna Macy said. She's an ecological pioneer, and she's an extraordinary woman. She's also been a practicing Buddhist for many decades. And I was listening to her talk with, the chap that was the assistant to Thich Nhat Hanh for many years, but I've just blanked on his name. Anyway, she talks about how we could either be the death doulas in this moment to a civilization and to a planet. I'm not worried about the earth, I'm sure it'll be fine, but the death doulas to our civilizations, or the midwives to a completely new form of living. Either way, both are transitions, both are worthy of our love and attention and our stewarding. And I really love that, because then it's about how you show up, and not predicting so much into the future. So yeah.
I love the mission statement for marketing, that we create longing and desire in pursuit of beauty.
That's an ideal.
Let's hope we can live up to that. So we're going to go to Kim and Elaine, and then anyone else who raises their hand. Otherwise, I'll get to ask more questions.
You've
Kim.
had your turn, Paul. Other people's turn now.
Hey, Kim, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. Firstly, thanks, Nathalie. There are so many little nuggets in there that have just got me thinking. Earlier on, I loved what you talked about, our multimodal selves, and I really love that. I work in the area of personal branding and showing up and all of that sort of thing, and I love this idea of it being holistic, not just single-faced. But what I was thinking about was, in embracing the multimodal selves, we're still operating in a world that's quite trajectory structured in terms of jobs and how we're supposed to behave. And I was sort of thinking about, where the gig economy emerged, and the whole point of the gig economy was to be able to dip in and out of different things. And I wondered whether there's a way of, I don't know, linking a gig mindset with that multimodalness of who we are. And is that something you've sort of explored or thought about before? I'd love your thoughts on that, actually.
Oh, what a juicy question.
Did my best.
No, great. So interesting. When you say gig economy, I think of projects, and I think it can be quite, for myself at least, I think it'd be quite daunting to think about having all of these plates spinning and not having completions, or like, what does a finished chapter look like, for instance. And so I try to live my life in projects, so whether it's like an art project or a music project or work with a client, and so that kind of creates some sort of form so that I don't get too lost. And I think there's maybe, and actually even within corporates, it might be that this, and I know this happens sometimes if people are running training, or there's a specific track where you're going to be in this job for a while, and maybe the project or the gig is 2 years as opposed to 2 months. But I think there is something around framing things in terms of projects. And there's something else I was going to say, it slipped my mind. What was it? The other thing that's helpful, thinking about things as experiments. Because I think one of the things that can happen, and this happens to me too, is like, shit, I'm trying something new, what if it doesn't work? And then it's like, hang on, but what if this is just an experiment? And then suddenly my whole body relaxes until I get stressed about it again, and then you have to do the same self-talk. I mean, it's not perfect, but I think that helps. So thinking about things in projects, thinking about things in terms of experiments. And then the other thing, which is just the richness of variety in one's life. And for some folks, I know some people for whom repetition is really joyful, and actually deep inquiry that has this sense of rhythm and cadence is what they're looking for. For many other folks, it might be that sort of kind of breaking out of that a little bit it could be more joyful than they realize. So it's also kind of taking those risks. What do you think?
So I like the idea of thinking of things as gigs, because I kind of think it like a musical gig. Like there is sort of this sense of completion, but I love the thinking of a gig as a sense of immersing yourself in whatever's going on. With projects, I kind of go into the business head.
Interesting.
And you know, when you said that, I kind of thought, oh, that's interesting. But you know, I sort of think, oh, I've got a gig, I'm going out with friends, or I'm going to a music show. Or so it's really interesting, the language. The other thing I wanted to share with you, when you talked about experiments, a few years ago, I came across a saying from Tom Peters from years ago, and he says, "Whoever tries the most stuff wins."
Oh, I like that.
And I love it. I tell it to all my coaching clients, everybody, and I kind of say, look, just try stuff out. Try it on, you know? Yeah. But but thank you for rattling with that juicy question. It was fab.
My pleasure. But I think that just sort of to touch on something you said, which I think is really important, is that different language has the same language can have different meanings for different people. And I think that's exactly the thing. It's for me, a project's like, ooh, project. And because I'm not in a corporate space, it has a different set of meanings. And so then maybe the thing underneath that is, what's the kind of language that would make this feel more like play or more like possibility, and then go with that.
And
which
what
I sense
brings
is
joy when you actually say it. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to Elaine. I'm glad you've come on camera, because when I saw Elaine's iPad, I wondered if this was going to be an Elaine avatar demonstrating the power of AI by delegating the question to your agent. But much better to get the real, at least what I perceive to be the real Elaine.
I think it was. Sorry, I've got running out of battery, so that's why I had to switch my video off. So sorry, not very well organised. I love idea, Kim. Whoever tries the most stuff wins. I'd love to try a dinner party when you never say what your job is. How fantastic would that be? And also love the idea of your values map. So I'm going to go and have a play with that afterwards. It's timely. So thank you. I've got a question that I've been struggling with a bit with AI, and I was dabbling with ChatGPT the other day in the topic of resilience, and then it said nothing in here, there's no new learning after 2021. And that's really interesting, because a lot of the research I've been doing is showing these massive leaps forward, whether it's in academia or other thinking. So I thought that's interesting. So anything it tells me now, potentially I'm ahead of the game. So if I take that and extend it a bit, you described yourself a few minutes ago as a late millennial. And you know, and then there's then there's the next generation. You know, we go from Gen Y, Gen X, and so on. And so it seems to me that AI is learning retrospectively, but would we ever have modeled, you know, millennials from baby boomers? Would we ever model what it will be in 2050? So the thing I'm struggling with a bit is, where does creativity go? Where does innovation go if it can only build predictive models based on the past? And I don't know, because I don't understand it enough. So I'd love to kind of get a little bit more insight. Thank you.
Oh God. Well, I agree with you. The first thing to say is that I think that there's something really myopic about, well, and it's the only way that we can do it, I guess, myopic about using training data, which is historic, to map out the future. And I don't know to what extent it's possible to, what would be interesting, I mean, you'd have to do this as kind of like I guess maybe a longitudinal study where you would have different AIs, and I'm thinking out loud here, so this might be absolutely awful, but you might have, for instance, different AIs predicting behaviors of, let's say, the next generation, which hasn't been born yet, based on training data that it has now, up until the time that those generations are born. So let's say predicting the behavior of 10-year-olds in 20 years' time. So there's 10 years of training data, the babies are born, they stop getting the data, and then they check again what the predictions of the AI were compared to the behavior of those then 10-year-old babies. That would be a way of figuring out how much accuracy there is in terms of prediction for the AIs at that time before they advance on, because obviously there's always going to be a lag. I'm not someone who knows that much about AI. I can think about sort of some of the more behavioral sides. But again, I suspect that you can't capture everything. And there's always the element of chaos, and there's always the element of creativity, of synchronicity. And so I don't think, I mean, the only way possibly we might be able to predict with 100% accuracy is if you actually put people, and this is something that dystopians sometimes talk about, dystopian sci-fi, put people into a sort of a matrix-like simulation where they are then neurochemically manipulated and plugged in to a machine where they can't physically escape. And then, I mean, then is that a human anymore? So like, but that's, yeah, I don't think that's going to happen in our lifetimes, and hopefully not for many generations to come, if at all. So I don't know, there's always a scope for possibility and for chaos and serendipity. And I don't think that AI is as intelligent or as wise, certainly not as wise as we think it could be. And then also we confuse intelligence with sentience. And there's lots of different people thinking about what that distinction is and whether it's appropriate to use terms like consciousness and sentience around machines. So, I mean, there's some really interesting, actually, maybe I can share with you. There's a couple of really interesting resources to listen to this from people who are much more versed in this world than I am. So Your Undivided Attention, I'm just finding them now, which is one, which is Asa Raskin, who runs the Earth Species Project, which is using AI to understand and communicate with animals, which is amazing. And also Tristan Harris, who runs the Center for Humane Technology. There was another one which I listened to recently, which was really good. I don't know if I have it here. Maybe I don't have it here. If I don't have it, then I'll send it across to Paul at the end and include it in show notes. But there's also someone else that's worth listening to is, I forgot his name now, the guy who runs Team Human, which is really interesting. And there's a couple of others. I'll pull them out of the pile.
Thank you.
Yeah, so you can listen to people who are much smarter and more educated in this than I am, but yeah.
Thank you, Nathalie.
Pleasure.
Some great comments in the chat and further resources from Nikki. And also just to add the comment, I was speaking to a researcher from the defense think tank RUSI recently, and they said the question that worries them is AI developing it, not necessarily its own consciousness, but its own agency. And so that was an interesting contribution. So I'll turn to Alan, however.
Hello.
Hi, how you doing?
Good, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. Look, I found it really, really interesting, and I particularly like the discussion we're having about the behavioral aspect of this. And maybe I've got a slightly different point of view to a lot of other people on these things, which is the example you gave of the agency where they just gave it to Midjourney and they managed to, to win the pitch. And then they thought, oh shit, that means we need one less person. I was actually thinking it's the wrong way around. What they're actually thinking is, we've got one more person we can use to go and do something else. And do you think there is a tendency on all of this all the time just to immediately go to the most pessimistic possible thing that could happen, which is that we blow up the Earth? Yeah. When in actual fact, the opportunities are endless to make things better, faster, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think there's a human thing in this that we're just kind of looking at the glass half empty all the time?
Oh, hang on. I can hear something else in one of my channels. Let me just, this that video thing where the videos go. So, right, sorry for the distraction. One of my tabs auto-played. I think there's something around negativity bias, which is what you mentioned in terms of how we have a tendency to think about the worst. That being said, and this is something that there's a podcast episode of Your Undivided Attention, which talks about the alignment problem, which I think is in the myths, myths busting one. I've posted about it on LinkedIn, but I can send you the link for that. But one of the interesting things that they talk about is what happens when the potential for damage creates cultural, economic, and political contexts in which the positive outputs are unable to land and make a difference. So, for example, if you have a situation in which it's possible to create misinformation, deep fakes, you have political instability, there's not enough people with jobs, there is so for instance, there was another one they were talking about in terms of the arms that you can then create, and you can 3D print guns, and you can create bioweapons, and all you need is 0.01% of the global population to have access to this, and we have large scale destruction. Are the benefits in that scenario of protein folding, new cures for cancer, being able to 3D print houses, being able to do precision farming, eliminating the need for pesticides, do any and all of those benefits make up for the huge potential loss of a civilization which is in complete disarray? And will any of those benefits actually count if you don't have a civilizational structure to benefit from them? And I'd never heard it put quite in those terms. So on the one hand, there are huge benefits potentially there for us. But on the flip side, and this is one of the things they were talking about that I've read elsewhere, we would need something like, so two things. One is it kind of like, I don't know if you read about the, you're probably familiar with this, but the nuclear peace treaties being predicated on the mutually assured destruction. We need something similar for AI, because if you don't have alignment between the biggest forces, you're not going to end up with anything other than a race to the bottom, which then means that you're not going to have civilizations within which these positive aspects of AI can actually land and make a difference. So they were talking about this, and also the fact that in order to get even to that point, because of the complexity, and it's not just nuclear weapons, it's all sorts of things being impacted, you would need to have a system in place that creates like a meta system that creates the possibility for people from different backgrounds, viewpoints, motivations, values to come together to agree on specific parameters to enable the preservation of life and certain things that are then not permissible anywhere in the world in AI development. So that there's just a huge amount of play, and this is well beyond my pay grade, but I think the idea of creating a system, a legal global system, which everyone buys into, that says this is okay to develop, this is not. So instead of like general artificial intelligence, you would have highly specified and siloed artificial intelligence that doesn't speak to each other. That's one of the examples that people have given in terms of how you could step forward and make advances without causing some of the issues of kind of like more general AI that can then create its own AIs and outstrip human abilities to kind of curtail it. Does that make, I don't know if, does that make sense the way I've described that? I don't know if that.
It makes sense. Yes, it's I just think we are, we're seeing the glass half empty.
And I think it's great that you're optimistic about this, because we need people with all perspectives making sure that we get a full idea about what's going on. Yeah.
And you could also think of AI as a force multiplier. I mean, if AI was championed by Alan and Nathalie, then I think I'd be glass half full. But if AI is being championed by Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, I'm probably glass pretty much empty.
Yeah.
And because this generates so much need for new learning. And I kind of wanted to ask what learning looks like for you, Nathalie, because I somewhat, from the outside, my sense is that rather than sort of learning for professional development, maybe you see learning as learning to inform a worldview, and then somehow trying to express that worldview through value propositions that, you know, enable you to flourish in your career. But what does learning sort of look like for you?
I don't know. I mean, I think I like to understand things. I like to understand complexity. I like trying to figure out connections between things. And I think also it's, I don't know if this is like a personality thing or being raised a certain way, but I'm so acutely aware of how much knowledge is out there and how tiny the little dot of knowledge that I have is, that it's kind of, it just, I suppose it's kind of connected with this deep thirst for understanding what other people think and perceive. I just want to learn as much as I can from that perspective. I'm really terrible at reading textbooks, don't enjoy it, doesn't make much sense to me. Also, when I'm writing a book and aggregating all this research, that's quite a painful process. What I like is synthesizing things together. But then, you know, that being said, there are certain painful learning processes that have joy embedded within them. And the hardest learning process I think that I ever went through was this 3.5-year BAA painting course, where, I mean, people would break down throughout the course because you're standing in front of an easel from 9 in the morning till potentially 8 at night with your own psychology, trying to learn something which is extremely difficult, requires a huge amount of skill, and that some people take decades to learn. And that was the biggest struggle, and my brain would hurt. And it was the most joyful thing I've ever done to date. And so there's something around the joy in the struggle. I think sometimes learning is beautiful more than other times, when it's just you have to do it because you need to know the fact or whatever it is to get to where you need to be. But yeah, I get bored if I'm standing still. It's just kind of a I don't know, personality trait.
In terms of writing your books, I was told by a biologist that we sort of forget some of our moments of pain, and that's an evolutionary advantage because we wouldn't do it again if we remembered them. And I know that there are times when I've said that writing my books felt like I was pulling barbed wire through my brain. But then with hindsight, it was, that wasn't too bad, was it? And I kind of think, maybe another one, might be possible. But I also wanted to ask, and if anyone has any final questions, because unfortunately we have to let Nathalie go at some point. But from a psychological perspective, is there a danger that we've lost a sense of the future? I mean, I remember listening to George Osborne I don't normally turn to George Osborne as my favorite commentator, but he made the case that nobody owned the future in politics anymore. Now, I don't think anyone can own the future, but I think he has a valid point that there isn't a sort of political leadership that is spelling out a vision of the future that we can find attractive here or in the UK and many other countries. I think in Spain there's quite a lot of difficulty with the current prime minister. May not last much longer. Is your sense, how can we, what's the psychology of how we can think about the future when so many fundamentals are actually open for question?
It's an interesting question. I was listening the other night to my partner created like a 90s and 2000s playlist for me, which I loved. And I remember saying to him, I was like, this was a time where I felt like the future was wide open and it was exciting, and the 90s were brilliant fun, and 2000s as well. There was always optimism, all this variety in music, and and obviously it's also associated with life stage where you're exploring, you're in your 20s, that is connected with a whole bunch of different factors and variables. But it's true that now when I think about the future, and when you look at some research around what people are worried about, there is not this sense of it being a place in which to land your dreams. It's kind of, there's a sense of dread, trepidation, insecurity, precarity for a lot of people, including people who, I'm making a living, I have a roof over my head, I'm not at any risk of flooding right now. Like, even in people who on paper are living the global South privileged lifestyle. So it seems to have seeped into, well, let's say like the global psyche, that there is turbulence. And I think times like that, and I maybe want to tread a bit lightly here, but there is something that I found really helpful, which is the power of having a rhythm or ritual that ties you into a sense of punctuating time that connects you to seasons or to community and to earth. So for instance, I live now in Barcelona and I've been here for a long while, and it's not like in London where you can go to, I used to live quite close to Hampstead Heath, where you go and you've got the seasons and it snows and it rains and it gets like spring, and then you get 3 days of summer, but at least you had a little bit of sun. It's kind of, here it's quite hard to see the seasons because you're in a city. And so I wanted to create a way of feeling time pass and connecting in by having to open my art studio every full moon and having people, any of my friends, come and do music and art, and we bring whatever we want to drink and we eat, and we're there singing and playing until the wee hours. And it's become a ritual which so many people now will come to, and if they're in town they join. And it's this sense of, even if you don't know what the macro future holds, you know that the next month on that date this is happening in this space and you can come if you want to. And there's something really powerful about that. And so there's a question around, how can we weave our own sense of rhythmic time with people that we love to create this sense of belonging with hopefully something that's joyful, and you can show up however you feel and feel like you are welcome. That for me is absolutely fundamental, because I think it's also this sense of, at least what I feel when it works really well, is when you're there with people that you care about and you're there for a common intention in a rhythmic way, then for those moments you're kind of suspended in time. You're not worrying about the future either, and you're not thinking about the past. You're kind of in that moment of presence. And that also is really nourishing and important. And I think we're so, and rightly so preoccupied by what can happen, and often so dragged back by what has happened, that we forget to really allow ourselves to fully live into the present moment. At least I find that for myself. I find it really hard. So yeah, finding more practices more frequently that you can do that plug you into the present moment, ironically creates, or perhaps not ironically, a more beautiful future. Yeah, that's what I might.
That is Elaine, yep, that absolutely was beautiful.
Oh.
Hannah Arendt, the German philosopher, said that ultimately the final advantage of democracy over dictatorship and totalitarianism was the capacity for renewal.
Oh,
I remember I recently had a reunion at my college, at my university, and it was sad when it came to an end, but it reminded me that those kind of rituals are a sort of punctuation. And in a sense, seeing, you know, hundreds of people that you haven't seen for 20 years, that kind of could go on forever, but there's an opening of it, there's a connection. Also, the closure is sort of an important part of the ritual in enabling life to happen, which is the only way that I can find to reconcile myself with the fact that we're out of time for today.
How elegantly closed.
And that all I can do is look forward to the next opportunity. I think everybody would like more opportunities to talk with Nathalie rather than fewer. So we're just so grateful.
Thank you for the joy.
I'm going to mention a couple of things we've got coming up. So next week we've got a working group call to support mentor mums on the 18th, and we'd love you to join, whether or not you were in their Coffee with a Cause session. We do have a little break for the summer holidays, but we have a fantastic lineup from August, from the end of August, including, we're following on from Elaine's session last summer with a session not just on our reading list, but what books we should all be writing, in our August 29th Marketing Kind with Steph Caswell, who wrote the book Dare to Write. And I promise you it's not all dragging barbed wire through your brain. And she'll also be giving insights into publishing. And then our first gathering of September will be our exchange with Andy Burnham, Mayor of Manchester, statistically one of the more likely future Prime Ministers, in which we'll be exploring the role of a mayor in addressing climate change and inequality. So a few things to look forward to. But for now, thank you so much, Nathalie, for a deeply nourishing fireside.
Well, thanks for bearing with me. I hope it was interesting. Yeah, it's been a pleasure hearing from you guys, and thank you for your attention and presence.
Wonderful.